the beauty of working with ice is not the fighting of it disappearing. It's really the embracing of it disappearing. That's what makes it special.
What is it about ice? Like, why ice?
To me, ice is the most under-investigated, underappreciated material. Ice is ephemeral, constantly changing, deteriorating, disappearing material. Ice has a volume but no color. With the transparency, it's crystalline in the sense that it really resolves its volume through light. So we have to think about refractions. Ice has, I think, a real fitting place in places like events industry because it's that one time, of the moment, kind of physicalizing the time passing kind of thing.
Is that something that kind of drew you to it in that regard? That this sculpture that I created at 8 o'clock is not going to be the same as the sculpture is at 9 o'clock.
I mean, that constant changing is definitely attractive. No matter how much we kind of have idea, a plan of what it will do, it's uh, always defies the expectations, because there are so many variables to what will change ice from the room temperature to the airflow to sunlight or how much people are touching, interacting, um, and and to me it's just humbling because you know my formal training as a painter, something that's incredibly on the up, static on the other end of it. And once you create something, it stays and lives with you. And on a personal level, I see what I learned from, but I'm always running to move on to kind of grow from that point. It's when you're making something, I think that stays, you're thinking about what next can you create. And in a way, I think there's a ghost that you always carry, when you're creating something static. Whereas in ice, it's gone, and there's something very liberating about it. And it has allowed me to just really focus and enjoy the process.
Is ice, from a technical standpoint, is it fundamentally harder or easier to work with than other sculpting mediums?
As a sculpting process is very similar to any other hard material carving. It's essentially reductive carving. But the tools that we use, from chainsaws, chisels, drills, saws, it's about taking away the negative material, and creating a form that lives within a space. So if you have a very sharp material, it's a very similar process. The big difference with, I think, any other material is that you can execute incredibly fast. Um, so what it takes in days and weeks, months with stone or wood, we can realize it in hours. And I think that's something very, very different.
Why is that? Is that just because ice is a more malleable material, or because of the techniques that you're using? Like, why are you able to do it faster?
I think with the sharp tools, it's very receptive to cutting. I think that's the interesting about ice as a material, is there's this constant kind of polar dichotomy to it, that it's because it's hard, but it's soft. It's strong, but it's fragile. And depending on how ice gets hit on the surface, at what angle, it reacts very differently. It's heavy, but it's buoyant. It floats in water. It's a very interesting material.
Yeah, I would imagine like you could crack it all the way through quite easily.
You can, but I mean, if you have an ice pick that has a force in one singular, point, it can shatter. But if you take a sledgehammer and try to break ice, it actually doesn't break that easily. So how you hit and where you hit, ice behaves very differently.
Could you translate to another medium easier than somebody could come into ice, do you think?
The act of carving is very similar. The tools we use to carve is very similar. But like with any material, it has its own tendencies that we all have to learn. So does it cross over well? Yeah, I think it does cross over well. And then the rest is all small things, you know. You know how ice behaves in below freezing environment is very different from how ice behaves in above freezing melty environment. How warm ice and cold ice interact is very different. And these little sciences that we know, we manipulate to the max to create what we create.
So where do you get the ice from? Like, does it have to? Is it a special kind of ice, or is it just, man, I just fill up? This is just regular old ice.
It is a special kind of ice. You know, in my industry standard, there's the ice, there's the carving blocks. It's a crystal clear ice. It's crystal clear because it's free of any air bubbles that's trapped inside that would naturally happen when you're freezing still water. You know, if you have a bucket of water in a freezer or below freezing environment, um, as is, you'll get very cloudy white ice, like ice you get in conventional freezer in your refrigerator, right? Those are tiny air bubbles that gets trapped inside because, you know, in the process, basically, when you're freezing from all sides, the last place that freeze is the middle of your water. And at that point, as water freezes, these air bubbles from air from H2O, you know, as it becomes more static, kind of release itself, and you know, there's no place for that to go. So you get these cloudy ice. Clear ice happens where we have two things: one direction freezing, so it's not freezing from all around, but from for our machines. And our machine is not a special machine that we build, but it's an industry standard machine. But it freezes from bottom up, where there's only a coolant in the bottom, and all the rest of the sides just have insulations to kind of keep the temperature focused. So it freezes bottom up. And the second thing is moving water, agitating the water as it freezes. By freezing one direction, you're keeping the impurities and air bubbles on the surface of the ice as it freezes. And by moving the water, it kind of brushes the surface of the water constantly and releases the air bubbles as it goes. It's a slower process than freezing still water, so it takes about 3 days a cycle. An industry machine makes 2 blocks per machine usually. Each block is about 300 pounds, about, you know, a little over 40 gallons of water. I mean, that's how you make it. I mean, it's often said that it kind of mirrors how lake ice is made, because lake ice is kind of inverting that idea. Lake ice naturally is kind of moving, circulating within that lake, so the water is constantly moving, and it's freezing from top down.
Will you ever use kind of like natural ice? Will you ever do that?
I have. I mean, I've had an opportunity. There are, you know, very choice ice sculpting competitions, exhibitions way up north. You know, there famous ones are like the Ice Alaska up in Fairbanks, Alaska, to Yellowknife up in Yukon Territory in Canada. You know, and where you can get natural ice, and it's where very hardcore ice carvers will love to come get together, and it's become a pilgrimage for you know, top ice carvers to, you know, eventually get to where you get to carve natural big blocks of ice to carve something. I've also had a chance, you know, opportunity to carve glacial ice in the past, you know, where I carve in an iceberg. That was really interesting. Um, that's a different ice, where ice resulted from, you know, just thousands of years of compacted snow and rain and whatever into it. It's actually not a great carving ice. It's got a lot of sediments and volcano ashes and all these things that will really damage your tools right away. And it's very, you know, porous and brittle and unexpected. But it's, you know, it's definitely a fun experience.
So then when you work on the ice, like what temperature are you, like, ideally, like you're trying to work on the ice in this temperature of a room?
There are two ways of carving that we all come across. You're either a wet carver or dry carver. Dry carvers are those who carve in the freezer or below freezing environment. Wet carvers are those who carve outside the freezer. there's a lot more variables to plan and think about because your ice is melting as you're carving. Now, clear ice is slow melting ice, much slower than kind of the conventional kind of cloudy white ice. Being clear of air bubbles means it's got least amount of surface areas, and the rate of melting, I mean, other than the temperature, is really the exposure to that surface, where air can really react to the temperature more. So crystal clear ice is very slow melting ice, and even in the hottest days, in the above 90 degrees, it's workable. And of course, we just have to plan that much more to it. You have to really plan your steps. You need to save your details to the very, very end. Where you want to think about where you want to exaggerate certain forms so you can kind of really hit that spot right when you're done. A dry carving is a different a game. When you're doing something very, very, meticulous, detailed, a dry carving in the freezer will definitely free us of worrying about losing those details. So at that point, you can really focus on the forms and really push the boundaries of the materials. But sometimes it's harder to see where you're gonna get because when you carve inside the freezer, your eyes tend to get a little bit, hazier. So in which case we have to kind of blowtorch the surface or heat gun the surface to get it all clear up. I think you'll learn a lot more as a wet carver. It's kind of a old school way, a old world way of carving something, and just like anything, the old ways is just everything's just more manual. It's everything's a little more right at the tip of your fingers, and you gotta be on your toes to get everything done. So
Is there a rivalry between the wet and dry carvers? Like, oh, look at this guy. It's a
yeah.
wet carver. He can't carve dry.
Well, I mean, if you can wet carve, I mean, everyone who dry carves, I mean, any wet carvers can go in the freezer and be like, wow, this is so great. It's not melting, so I can have so much more fun. But I've come across many dry carvers who've only carved inside the freezer, just panic when you're carving outside because, they haven't had the foresight, that brain muscle to really know to plan your course of action, because your ice is melting. So I think there's definitely an advantage when you know how to wet carve.
Do you have to kind of anticipate how the ice is going to change? Like, okay, I'm going to make this feature, but I know I have to make it like this and then let it melt down and then it will look the way that I want it to.
Yeah, there's definitely certainly way to modify, manipulate, accommodate, adjust the design based on melting. Um, but mainly it's really, again, like knowing ice as a material. Oftentimes what we do, we run an arts business, you know. We carve something and it has to leave the studio. It needs to be wrapped. It needs to be transported, oftentimes disassembled in parts, and then delivered to a site, and then reassembled, and then go through the duration of the event, and live through its peak, viewing in those hours. So, we have to think about all of that as we're carving it. So if you're carving something pointy, we'll often not take it to that point, but give a little bit of bluntness, blunt tip at the edge. And that gives strength so that when you hit it, when you wrap it or as we hold it, it doesn't just break off. But it has enough taper that as it starts melting, and even then, like it has, it has suggestions of point already, but strength given by its volume and the way it melts really kind of follows that form. Some carvers may keep it chunky and say, well, this is going to look great, a couple hours into it. But I realize that it's, if the silhouette, if the lines are correct and tight, it it uh, it melts that way. If you carve chunky, it stays chunky even as it melts away and disappears. And I always believe that with ice sculpture, it's the first impression. And as it melts away, that memory still kind of stays, you know? So it's I to me, ice experiencing ice sculpture is really more about the memory of what it is than what really is.
That kind of leads us into some of our listener submitted questions. So, are you ready for some harder slash listener submitted questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, this first one is kind of along those lines in the sense that do you look at the fact that it melts as sad or what makes it special?
I certainly am in a camp of it being very special that it melts away. On a personal level, it's that practice of letting go for me that I really appreciate. It's I get to really focus on the process. The beauty of working with ice is not the fighting of it disappearing. It's really the embracing of it disappearing. That's what makes it special. It's really amazing when people see our work and be so amazed at how much work we put into something that's disappearing. And that gap really activates the sculpture and that I think the art experience like nothing else. A sculpture do.
Follow up that insightful and thoughtful answer with how do you get rid of it? Like, do they just let it melt? Do they just throw it in the bathtub? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, there's a lot of logistics there. There's definitely an art of its own in disposing ice, but essentially it's about breaking it and controlled, contained breaking. Um, And again, that similar question of is it sad to break it can come into play. But I think all of us who work with ice also find it incredibly liberating to break it away too. If anything, it's like this stress reliever. We often joke how we see these like break rooms where people can go into like abandoned cars and smash things to relieve your stress. It's very close to that. I mean, it's great to go in there and just break everything. I mean, that's if our job is to just break what we got, it can be really fun. We can use various tools to break our ice, but our favorite tool of choice is a simple, good old ice pick.
Is there anything that you can't do in the sense that, like, oh, I would really like to do this. I would really like to do this sculpture, but you just can't do that with ice?
There's a lot you can do with ice. I mean, the only thing is we can't defy gravity. I mean, that's what I say to my clients. We get to work with car designers and design a runway and lighting designers, and we've made chandeliers out of ice and hanging from the trusses, and there's so much that we've been challenged to do, and it's really about solving problems.
What was your personal favorite piece? Thing that you've done that's like, oh, that was my favorite.
My favorite pieces are all public installations, just because it's where we get to show slice of magic of what we do, and having uh, the people who didn't expect to encounter our work to find in their passing our days to see our work and then interact with it and interact physically, where our pieces are, where we invite people to touch our ice. That's another thing that I always love is I love people touching our work. In kind of a art world etiquette, you don't touch art pieces. You don't touch sculptures, but when people touch our sculptures and then be like, oh wow, it's ice, it's really ice, and it's really this big, and why is it here? And again, I love making ice sculptures in this city that I work in because we've got to do some really cool things, and we get to have a lot of people experience our work. I've done pieces where we've frozen 1,000 pairs of flip-flops in the middle of Union Square where people were invited to, try to melt the ice away and to grab, pairs of flip-flops. Or, we've done, um, you know, uh, cityscape inspired pillars of ice where people can walk around like a maze. Just really cool things, and to be able to again share with uh, people who are unexpecting.
So this one here,
Yeah.
this is essentially a shoe. Like, how did you do this?
I mean, this is a great example of really having that little sneak peek of the whole magic of how you create something, This is um, a video piece collaboration we did with Hype Beast, where I got to carve, the Air Jordan. I mean, you can see in the video, it starts from a block of ice, and I cut it to the overall volume of the block, and I did a simple grid transfer of the image, and then I use a chainsaw. No matter how big, how small the sculpture is, I would say about 70% of the work we do, we use a chainsaw. It's an electric chainsaw that we use. Um, and I cut the negative space, and then I do the basic leveling, the kind of the volume, the angles. I push the chainsaw as much as I can. It's amazing. You can see how amazing level of finesse you can get from something as brute as chainsaw. There's a lot that you can do. And then once we have the shape pretty much set, I use what we call a chipper, which is basically like a multi-prong ice pick, which has been kind of a preferred tool, very similar to chisels, but much easier to maintain, and it eats ice much easier. So I use a chipper or a chisel to get the final overall volume. And then I use die grinders to really fine tune that shape. And die grinders have different bits, the heads that can create the shape. Like in this video, I have burr, which is this tiny prickled bit. It's an orange head bit that you see in the video that really shaves off all the corners and edges of the shape that I've chipped away. And that really kind of smooths out the overall shape. And I really kind of finish the total complete outer volume of the shape. And then from there, I use finer bits like knife bits and needle bits, as we call them. As you can see from the name, they had a finer tip. Sometimes I'll finish off with small chisels to, push down certain areas so it look like it's overlapping, one's on top of the other or going under. That's about it. And then I finish it off with either a torch or sometimes even a splash of water, and get it all nice and clear.
I noticed that, but why is the now? Why does the blowtorch make it look like that? Like I'm looking at it, and it's a little bit. I'll just use the word like kind of cloudy, and then you hit it with that blowtorch, and I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the final tools that we use are so fine that in between the tool bit marks, snow gets inside. So the haziness comes from the snow, and in this instance, it was a nice cold day, so there's some frost that can remain or maintain on the ice surface. So we often do a finish with either water or blowtorch to get the true clarity, to really kind of basically melt down the snow particles that sticks to the ice. And once that's cleared up, once we put it in the freezer, all those wet surfaces will dry up right away, and it becomes a stable, final stage of the sculpture.
Now, how long did that take you to do?
I mean, the sculpture itself probably took about an hour itself to really carve it. I would like to go fast as I can because I'm carving outside the freezer one, so I'm wet carving here. So ice is slowly melting, but I can go that fast because I took my time to plan my tools. I can go that fast because I did my drawing. So I think it's a very fair thing to always calculate what how much plan goes in there too.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between the time that like I'm actually
Yeah.
physically working on it versus the preparation for it. Let me
Yeah,
find
yeah.
like it's really impressive. I have no artistic ability
No.
whatsoever. Like just is this a whole car?
Yeah, that was a fun collaboration I did with Porsche. Um, and this was cool because I got to carve the replica of the sculpture. Um, and then we blowtorched it down to nothing. But then the director then played it backwards, so, as if the fire is what's making the sculpture. So
Oh.
that was his narrative, and gave me this concept, and I just thought it was so brilliant. Simple and direct, and really kind of turning itself.
I'm amazed at the amount of intricacy that you can get in there. Now,
Yeah.
okay, I don't know anything about art, so this question is might not make any sense. But like, how do you get kind of the perspective on it in the sense where like you can see the angles, it looks three-dimensional? Like, do you have to account for the way that light is going to hit it?
Creating a sculpture, I mean, to do anything, right? Anything you do, you break it down to small pieces, and it's about putting together the building blocks to get to your goal, right? Um, so for sculptures, it's a 3D piece. We can break it down to a series of 2D pieces, you know? So you understand the front, the sides,
Yeah, yeah.
right? The backs and tops. You take those measurements, you and then you piece them together, and you naturally get the 3D piece. Achieve that. That said, in our studio, I think almost all of my carvers that I work with, they're painters, and maybe because one, my background is in painting. I'm a painter. I think everything in paintings. Um, but I think too, as a painter, as a draftsman, I quickly learned that you carve as well as you draw. you know you need to know how to draw, and especially because what we do, we don't make sculptures that investigates the material of ice. What we do is not just abstract pieces. It's not what we want to do only. We create pieces what our clients bring to our table every day, and one day we'll carve a replica of you, Nick, we carve a replica of a Porsche, or Air Jordan sneakers, or a logo, or a building, or whatnot, or a kangaroo, and we need to have this basic knowledge of proportions of things in the world. We often talk about that. You kind of have to know these things. You have to have a very uh, deep, I think, sixth sense of what things kind of is shaped like. We all have this general curiosities of shape in everything, and that's a very very special thing that I always look for with people that I work with. You just have to be curious about everything.
So what is this? Tell me about this.
This was a collaboration we've done with Hunter Boots. People love seeing things frozen inside ice. When you see something frozen inside ice, again, there's another sense of timelessness. There's a, frozen in time that's literally there.
That's pretty much all the questions I've got. Is there anything that you think that we missed or anything like that?
Ice sculpting, ice carving, I think is fascinating because it kind of exists outside of, I think, what people understand as an art world. It's essentially an outsider art genre. You know, it's a sculpture that's often mostly done by non-art trained artists, you know, because ice carving most often come across, especially in America, through culinary lineage. It's many of the ice carvers are people who were ex-chefs, and it's a very passionate community. It's a very innovative community because almost all of our tools are something that's developed from taking tools off the shelf from hardware stores and then modifying it to work with ice and then sharing that with ice community at large. So I fell in love with this craft, I think a lot less about the craft itself, but really people. And even for today, I have so many mentors in the ice community who are constantly pushing the material, and I really owe to them more than anything with what we get to do every day. And I don't take it for granted all the knowledge and skill set that we have. That it's really in the the pillars and foundations of um, so many crazy ass people who work with ice.